Welcome, everybody. I do have to say a couple of things. Apparently, there are some fabulous books here that Matt knows about, and also to say that Dougald's got a piece in the latest XR book called "This Is Not a Drill." Is that right? Yeah. Coming out this week, so keep an eye out for that one. And also to say that we are going to try and use a hashtag. We've gone for the hashtag Café Disruptif. If you do make any comment or take any photographs, please feel free. And if you do tweet those out, then we will try and capture them if we possibly can. I'm going to try and read this now. Yeah, my few words of welcome are premised on the fact that it seems to be quite difficult to find places of safety at the moment, which is a very odd way to welcome people, but I think it's really important to acknowledge where we are. We find ourselves in times of actually indigestible trouble, and we're wrestling daily, psychologically, emotionally, sometimes physically, in times of environmental, economic and political uncertainty with the demons that come out to dance to what to our ears sounds like the shrieking songs of fear and instability. As our skies creak like overloaded roof timbers under the impossible burden of carbon they should not have to carry. And our souls and bellies struggle in the knowledge that it was us, actually, it was us that held it up there, and it's us that is still hurling it up there. I've said much about this over the years, and I'm going to say no more tonight. I invite you instead to join with us in Café Disruptif and the wider network as we learn to dance, albeit clumsily and with many a bruised shin, with those demons of uncertainty, and to see the terrible beauty, terrible in its truest sense, and grace therein. And to hear the words of Dougald Hine, who we had the pleasure of spending some time with yesterday at the workshop that Matt organised. So I leave you now with some of the last sentences of Dark Mountain's manifesto, which I highly recommend to you. There's a red copy here, you can find it online, as it talks of our craving now, in the midst of all this uncertainty, in the midst of all this rupture and turmoil, for a map of certainty, a direction, a trajectory. Something I get asked for at every single talk I give now. So what? So where do we go and how do we get there? We want a route to follow into the darkness, an action plan, a lamp, a civilized, in-charge, controlling eye of order and safety. A sort of counter-knowledge to all that difficult stuff that we cling on to in something not far from despair that someone has got this, right? The manifesto asks something different. It's an invitation, a provocation, an honouring of uncertainty and uncivilizedness. It asks us to be wary of that yearning for someone else's map. It says in the last few paragraphs, even here, we go carefully, for cartography itself is not a neutral activity. The drawing of maps is full of colonial echoes. The civilized eye seeks to view the world from above as something we can stand over and survey. The uncivilized writer knows the world is rather something we're enmeshed in, a patchwork and a framework of places, experiences, sights, smells, sounds. Maps can lead, but can also mislead. Our maps must be the kind sketched in the dust with a stick, washed away by the next rain. They can be read only by those who ask to see them, and they cannot be bought. This, then, is uncivilized writing. Human, inhuman, stoic, and entirely natural. Humble, questioning, suspicious of the big idea and the easy answer. Walking the boundaries and reopening old conversations. Apart but engaged, its practitioners always willing to get their hands dirty. Aware, in fact, that dirt is essential, that keyboards should be tapped by those with soil under their fingernails and wilderness in their heads. We tried ruling the world, we tried acting as God's steward, then we tried ushering in the human revolution, the age of reason and isolation. We failed in all of it, and our future destroyed more than we were even aware of. The time for civilization is past. Uncivilization, which knows its flaws because it has participated in them, which sees unflinchingly and bites down hard as it records. This is the project we must embark on now. This is the challenge for writing, for art to meet. This is what we're here for. Thank you.
Great. So Manders and Café Disruptif are co-hosting this event with the Dark Economies Research Group. So my thanks to Dave Pryor and Tanya Krzyzewinska and the other heads who've been involved in supporting both this and the workshop that happened yesterday. So I'm just going to read a few words about that and about Dark Mountain and join some dots between them before we start. So the top line of the Dark Economies Research Group says that it sets out to examine ways in which our collective experience and future are informed and shaped by darkness. Here's a quote. "These are shadowed times, no question. A tide of loss runs through all our lives. The knowledge that our kind has brought about the sixth great dying in the long life of the earth. The promises which once offered to hold our societies together now ring hollow to many. The maps by which we were taught to make sense of the world no longer fit the landscape." So those are the words of our guest, Dougald Hine, a writer, teacher, and culture maker by his own description. Dougald, as you've just heard, co-authored the Dark Mountain Manifesto in 2009 with Paul Kingsnorth and was hurtled into a kind of unexpected acceleration on the back of that, from which he's co-steered the Dark Mountain Project, whose regular journals are all here, that emerged from it. Dougald himself is now moving on to a new chapter after this summer, leaving this project in the good hands of others. And his new projects include the curation of a project called A School Called Home with his partner Anna Björkman. We were delighted to have Dougald with us yesterday for a workshop out at the End of the World Garden project with Paul Cheney at Trevova. And it brought together staff, students and public. We had members of the Multi-Faith Chaplaincy team, Cornwall Council, Café Disruptif, Extinction Rebellion and others. There were lots of good things that came up in the day, and you might hear some of them tonight because I can see quite a few of the participants in that workshop here. But one thing Dougald said really stuck with me, and I wanted to bring that here tonight. He said, "We know the game is up, but we don't know how to know it, but we often don't know how to know it." I thought that was an interesting idea. So one of the questions we were talking about is, what kind of space allows that dark knowing to emerge, to lay its hand on you, if you like, or allow our eyes to adjust to it? I think one of the things I wanted to bring here as well is the curious difficulty of any such kind of knowing happening inside a university. I don't know if you can, maybe we can unpack that a bit this evening. But I may offer this building we're in now as an allegory in this kind of creative arts university that's flourished here since 1970, when there were 28 students in a red brick building just down the road. And now you stand inside this much bigger thing it's become. And across exactly that same period of time, since 1970, we have bodies like the World Wildlife Fund telling us 61% of all animal life on the planet has gone. 75% of insect life, the life that supports the whole of the rest of the ecosystem, has gone. 40% of oceanic plankton, that provides by itself 1/3 of our atmospheric oxygen, has gone since 1970. So where do we put that kind of knowing? What do we do with it? Storytelling is obviously one space for that. And that's a space that the Dark Mountain have quietly held open for the past 10 years. Dougald's introduction for tonight mentions the extraordinary and sudden emergence of the school strikes movement and Extinction Rebellion in what's only the past 8 months. You all look a bit old for school strikers, but have we got any Extinction Rebellion people here? I think? Good, yes. Behave yourselves. The arts too have begun to reflect this shift in awareness, from the work of Culture Declares Emergency to this year's Pulitzer Prize winner, Richard Powers' The Overstory. There's a great interview between Dark Mountain editor Nick Hunt and Powers in the latest volume of Dark Mountain that's worth checking out. It's online as well. So The Overstory offers a deep dive into anthropogenic mass extinction, into human-driven mass extinction. And it manages to come out the other side with its love for humanity intact, which I think is a really crucial achievement. And Powers was asked in an interview, you can again find online with Shakespeare & Co., he was asked why his why he'd written a story that didn't, as novels will tend to, include some kind of bracketing counter-perspective, the kind we kind of used to in arts universities, the kind of critiquing counterpoint of view. This was his answer to it. So I'm just going to conclude with this and then welcome Dougald. This is Powers speaking now. The world that does not share our values is coming back to haunt us. There's something we have to figure out. It's not really that ambiguous. We've treated ourselves as exceptional, independent, autonomous agents. And we can't. We can't survive that way. And we're not. We are deeply imbricated with the rest of the living world, and I don't want to mince around with moral ambiguity about that. I just wanted to write a book that says, this is the case. I would say if there's any villainy or evil in this book, it's just that small part of us that we all share that takes miracles for granted. So please welcome Dougald Hine. Thanks.
Hello. Here we are, deeply imbricated in the modern human world that's being represented, amongst other things, by the seagulls stomping on the roof and a few other presences that we're sharing the space with. It was strange listening to those few lines that Manda read from the Dark Mountain Manifesto, because it's a bit over 10 years now since Paul and I wrote that text, and that's feels like a long time ago. But I wanted to start this evening by taking us back a bit further, not very far in the Earth's terms, but a fair distance in human terms. Because when the talk turns to endings, the way it tends to do on nights like this, I find myself wanting to start with the Natufians. The Natufians were, by some accounts, the first of us to settle. This is 14,000 years ago in territory that is marked on our maps just now as Israel and Palestine, Jordan, and parts of Syria, Lebanon. They lived in year-round villages, and they may have been the first humans to do that. In small round houses with roofs that we guess must have been made of leaves and branches. After 14,000 years, there's not that much left of us, apart from bones and stones. But the patience of archaeologists is rewarded from time to time with glimpses. So we know that they buried their dead in graves that were lined with flowers. In one of the burials, there was an old man cradling the bones of a puppy. At one site, there is a small object, a little smaller than the size of your fist, that is the first carved image of a man and a woman having sex that we know of. These are a few of the traces that they've left to us. The Natufians were named for us. We don't know what name they knew themselves by. Whatever is left of their stories has gone underground into other people's stories. But they were named for us by a woman called Dorothy Garrod, who was pretty remarkable in her own right. And one spring late in the 1920s, she came to the Wadi an-Natuf, which these days is a rocky, dusty valley in the West Bank, northwest of Ramallah. And the workers on her dig were village women from the local Palestinian village. And together they uncovered layers within this cave that looks a bit like a kind of dark mouth opening in the hillside. And they charted a set of layers which to this day form the basis for the archaeology of that region. And among those layers, they found the evidence of these people who Dorothy Garrod named for us as the Natufians. And ever since the traces of their villages began to be found, the question has been asked by archaeologists, okay, these may have been the first people living in settled villages, so were they also the first people to discover agriculture? Because we like the past to point in our direction. The image of the bone being thrown by the savannah ape that spins until it becomes the space station captures it very succinctly. But the stories we tell about the past are often stories about how we became us here and now, and the inevitable heroic journey leading on that route. And as it became clear quite how old the Natufian settlements were, the question became more intense within the archaeological debate, and over the decades it went backwards and forwards one way and the other. And these days it seems fairly clear that the Natufians had not yet discovered the trick of saving and replanting seed that becomes the thing that gets called the agricultural revolution, the Neolithic revolution. But one of the leading archaeologists who owns this field, in the way that academia can be quite proprietorial at times, says, but they do mark the point of no turning back on the way towards settled agricultural civilization. And I find it a very striking statement, because the one thing we know about the Natufians, or at least from what I've learned, is that they did turn, if not back, then aside. They turned aside after a very long time of living a settled existence in villages in what was quite an abundant landscape in the late Ice Age period when they were living. And then something happened to them. They were hit by climate change. Way off to the north, the glaciers and the ice caps were thawing as the Ice Age was coming to an end. And over the continent of North America, a huge meltwater lake was building up behind an enormous dam of ice and of stones deposited by the movements of glaciers. And then it burst, and this flood of fresh, cold water entered the North Atlantic and sent the region that is governed by the North Atlantic back to as cold as it had been at the depths of the last Ice Age for about 1,200 years, a period that's known to us as the Younger Dryas. And the Natufians wouldn't have known that that was going on. What they knew was that the seasons were no longer coming the way that they had come for as long as anyone could remember, and that the landscape was quickly becoming more arid and sparse. And within probably a generation or so, they abandoned their villages and went back to living a wandering nomadic life, a shorter and harsher life than the generations who had lived in these villages had known. Returning to the remains of their ancestors' houses only to rebury the bones of their dead among the ruins. And there are three things that haunt me about the story of the Natufians. The first is the sheer length of time that they had lived in those villages. It's reckoned to be 1,500 years of the early Natufian settled culture across a widening spread of the Near East. And in an oral culture, that's long enough for any memory of earlier ways of living as nomadic hunters and gatherers to have passed into the dream time of gods and culture heroes. How unimaginable must it have been? 1,500 years, so, we're talking from, the beginning of what we call the Dark Ages to now. 50 generations. The second thing is the way that the story refuses to deliver a moral. It's not a morality tale about how they cut down the last tree and doomed their civilization. It's just a change in the weather. Not only did they not have an explanatory framework to talk about what was going on in terms of climate systems, nor did they have any basis on which to put themselves at the center of the story of why and how that was happening. It's just what it's like being alive in a world like this. And given the kind of moral weight of a lot of what we talk about when we talk about a thing like climate change, I think it's worth being reminded that that's part of what it's like to be part of a living world like this, that history on a human and on a climatic and on a geological scale isn't a morality tale, that sometimes history is a lot like the weather. And the third thing that haunts me about it is a passage in the book where I first learned about the Natufians, book by Stephen Mithen, who's a professor of archaeology at Reading University. It's a book called After the Ice, A Global Human History 20,000 to 5,000 BC. And he does an extraordinary job of traveling through the state of the academic knowledge about how humans lived in all different corners of the world on that journey from the depths of the last ice age to the point where in a few corners of the world the first traces of things which we in hindsight tell the big story of civilization around were happening. And I have a feeling that Mithen is also haunted by the Natufians because they're the only group of people to whom he returns twice in the course of the book. And he has this lovely device where he alternates between passages where he discusses the scholarship and passages where he sends an imagined time traveler wandering through the landscapes and communities and lives that he has been talking about in scholarly terms. And when he comes back the second time to the late Natufians, these wandering bands of people who are the descendants of the people who lived in those villages, he has his time traveler tag along unseen at the back of a small band who are arriving at the ruined village for a gathering, a point where they come together with other members of the wider community of which they are a part. And he describes it as a time of respite, a time in which they have brought the bones to be reburied and stories are told and relationships are forged and people in some cases leave with a different group to the group that they arrived with. And yet, at the end of it, when they are trailing back out onto the land, Mithen writes, he imagines, he suggests, they are all grateful for the return to their transient lifestyle within the arid landscapes of the Mediterranean hills, the Jordan Valley, and beyond. It is, after all, the only lifestyle they have known, and it is the one that they love. There are many things that are different about our situation and the time of endings which we find ourselves in to the story that Mithen is telling, drawing on the bones and stones and traces and speculations of archaeology about the Natufians. But we are also facing the unraveling of the only lifestyle we have known and the one that we love. And it's a story that needs to be handled with care. But there are moments when I find it helpful to realize that whatever stories may be told of us by those who come after us, and I don't think any of us really expect that those stories will speak kindly of us. Nonetheless, as long as there are creatures like us around, they will be living the only lifestyle they have known and the one that they love. And some of the loss that is involved for us has a strange tangled overlap between an objective claim that things have never been better and the way of life that many of us in this room were born into and represent is the best way of living that humans have ever had. And if I wanted a shorthand for that, I might call it the Hans Rosling story. That is always tangled up with things that are more particular and specific, that are about our attachment to the particular way of life that we were born into, that might actually look more questionable to people in other times and places than they have mostly looked to us, because it was the lifestyle we were born into. And somehow I wanted to start there tonight, because what I want to talk about is what it means to be living in a time of endings, how we make sense of that, how we make sense of it in particular in this moment where, as Matt and Manda have already gestured towards in the introduction, something fairly extraordinary has been going on over the last year or so. And among the things that, among the ways we might talk of that, okay, we have XR as a prominent element within the mix of that. We have the school strikes. We have the impact that Jem Bendel's deep adaptation paper has made and the conversations gathering around it. We have David Wallace Wells' book. We have lots of other things that aren't necessarily getting the same level of attention, but are part of a cultural moment that, I think for those of us who have spent a long time working in one way or another with the realities of climate change, with what we know and fear about what is around and ahead of us, it's been at times disorienting over the last year, actually, to see this sudden cultural eruption going on. And among the things that we could say about it is that there's a lot of coming alive in the face of dark knowledge about where we are, how we got here, what lies around and ahead of us. And that's one of the qualities that I would really, salute within this set of movements and moments of the past year. And in order to get into the pieces that I would like to offer and throw into the conversations going on around here, as I'm passing through over this couple of days. I want to take you back just to May last year, which isn't very long ago, but precedes this cultural moment that has a lot to do with why there are so many people in this room tonight, I suspect. And to a place close to where I live these days, to a set of buildings that look a bit like a kind of Italian monastery, so that on a bright spring day you can get caught off guard because you step outside and the temperature is 2 seasons colder than it looked like from the view from the windows, because we're a long way north of the Alps. This is on the shores of Lake Mälaren in Sweden, not far outside of Stockholm, a place called the Sigtuna Foundation. When I moved to Sweden 7 years ago, not long after I arrived there, a friend of mine was passing through one of the fiercest activists I've ever known, somebody whose work has included providing technological support to activists in the Syrian resistance in the early months after the Arab Spring, through to fighting for transgender people's right to exist. And we were sat in a pool of cool April sunshine outside a cafe in Stockholm, and she stretched her arms and said, this is the one country where I come to where I feel like I'm back from the front line. And having lived in Sweden for 7 years, I can say that no country is without its front lines, but it's true that, well, if I was speaking to a Swedish audience, I would probably say, Sweden is going to be the last country to notice what is happening. There's a reason why one of Sweden's national exports is professional optimists, Hans Rosling among them. 200 years of neutrality creates a certain set of conditions, and those conditions can be useful. In the early 1940s, along the main street of Sigtuna, a street whose layout hasn't changed in 1,000 years, in a room above one of the shops, the German theologian and resistance activist Dietrich Bonhoeffer met with Bishop Bell, who had travelled from England, bringing news from the German resistance of their plans to assassinate Hitler. There is a sense of being on the kind of neutral ground where certain conversations that need to happen away from the front lines can happen. And the Sigtuna Foundation, where we were last May, is a place that has that quality. It was set up as a foundation that should be a neutral ground where representatives of the church and the arts and science could meet on ground that wasn't owned by any of them. And it's been for 100 years hosting those kinds of conversations. And Climate Existence, the conference that I was there for, continues that tradition. It's a place where we come together from different spheres, from different fields, to talk about climate change without trying to hold it at arm's length, to grapple with what it means to be changed by what we know. And two contributors on the first day of that conference made a very powerful impact on me. One was Kevin Anderson, who some of you may have come across, Deputy Director of the Tyndall Centre, Professor at the University of Manchester. He's also just come to the end of 2 years as Visiting Professor of Climate Leadership at Uppsala in Sweden. He's a climate scientist who spent the early years of his career as an engineer building oil rigs. He's got the bluntness of an engineer from the north of England, and the moral clarity of a man who has not flown in many years in a field where many people wrestle with or attempt to justify to themselves and others the very large carbon footprints associated with their work. And Kevin was updating us on where we were at 2.5 years after the Paris summit, how things were going. And he doesn't tend to mince his words. And the way I remember it, he said, basically, in order to have even the slightest chance of meeting the goals that were agreed at Paris, impossible things need to happen. Things that are beyond the boundaries of what has been treated as possible, even by the most progressive elements within our politics on their best days over the last 30 years. And he said the slightly less bad news is that if we look at the major political events of the past decade, most of them were impossible until they happened, according to everybody whose job it is to narrate politics and how the world works to us. Whether that's the financial crash, the Arab Spring, Trump, Corbyn, Brexit. And the point is not which of the items on that list we might think of as good things. The point is what it tells us about the nature of the times in which we are living. And Kevin's suggestion, which I think I agree with, is that we are living in the kind of times when impossible things happen surprisingly often, and that there might be a dark trace of hope within that. And I remember listening to that without anything like XR on the horizon to give any particular concrete encouragement about what that might look like. And remembering the other talk that had blown my mind that day, which was by Vanessa Andreotti, who is Professor of Race, Inequalities and Global Change at UBC in Canada. And I had the great pleasure of meeting her and introducing her at that conference, and we've become friends and collaborators over the last year. And I find her work really exciting. And one of the things she said that day that stuck with me, she said, she comes from Brazil, from an indigenous background, and she said, where I come from, we have a saying, when there's a flood coming and the water's rising, when the water reaches your ankles, you can't swim. When the water gets to your knees, there's still no point in swimming. But when the water reaches your arse, it's time to start swimming. In other words, there are situations in which things have to get bad enough for something to flip from being impossible to possible. And I remember putting those two thoughts about possibility and impossibility together at the plenary session at the end of those 3 days and saying, I'm wondering where the waters are deepest in our societies. Because my concern is, and I'd be a little bit less confident about saying this today than I was in May last year, but I think I still agree with myself. My concern is that when it comes to climate change, the waters are still mostly somewhere between here and here for people in societies like this. And if I had to look for the places where the waters are highest in these societies, my guess would be that it's loneliness and mental health amongst young people and addiction to network technologies and precarity and the general draining of meaning within working life, that actually these are probably the places where the water is closest to being up to the arse, where we might actually be ready to start swimming in the sense of impossible things happening. And I think that maybe if we go back through some of the items, whether we value them as good or bad, within the list of the impossible things that have happened in recent years, it might make sense to think of them in relation to some of the items on that list. So, obviously those things are, the very definition of first world problems. Compared to what climate change means right now in Kiribati or in Mozambique or in many other places, where it's literally an existential question, a question of the ability to go on existing and subsisting in a place. There aren't that many places yet in a country like Britain where that is what climate change means. And certainly the items on my list of where I think the water is deepest in societies like this, can't compete for their intensity, their importance and urgency with a whole set of issues, not just climate change, that are affecting far larger numbers of people in other parts of the world whose lives are tangled up with ours by supply chains and histories, unfinished, ongoing histories of colonialism. But the question I'm really asking is just, in the societies that need to change the most fastest, if we're to have a chance, and it's only a chance, of avoiding the worst of what lies ahead, where are the places where impossible change might come quickly? And I think, again, if we look at a movement like Extinction Rebellion and the impact that it's had and the sense of coming alive that has gone on around it, I think that part of that is that in the process of allowing ourselves, allowing our lives to be called into question by climate change, it makes room as well for things that address some of those other questions, some of those other places where we're deep in the water or in something else in these societies. I have this strong memory of November last year of watching footage shot on camera phones on the streets of capital cities with famous landmarks in the background, of people with fluorescent cloth bringing their everyday business as usual of a capital city to a halt. And there was something really uncanny about the way that these two movements on opposite sides of the channel, Extinction Rebellion and the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, emerged literally on the same day, November the 17th, last year. And there was an obvious point that was well made by George Monbiot that day about the BBC being far happier to give coverage to French protesters protesting against fuel price rises than British protesters protesting about climate change. But it's too easy, and I think actually we've got beyond that. I think there have been quite a lot of helpful contributions that have pushed us beyond the simple opposition in which a movement like the Gilets jaunes is the bad guys and XR is the good guys. But I think it's really important to look at what can be learned from the juxtaposition of these two movements, the extent to which they both belong to this cultural moment that emerged since last summer. And I think it might be helpful to think about what went up in smoke on the streets of Paris over those weeks as the fantasy of green neoliberalism. The fantasy, Will Davies, the sociologist, describes neoliberalism as the attempt to disenchant politics by means of economics, to shortcut the work of politics, the debates, the arguments, the value judgments, the processes of collective decision-making and being part of a society, to shortcut that by means of using the mechanisms of market, competition, pricing. And I think, in a way, what happened with the clumsily attempted climate policies through fuel tax rises in France was the impossibility of avoiding politics whilst trying to tackle climate change was brought into focus. Macron, who had put so much store on wanting to provide leadership on climate change, and actually if you try to do that simply by playing with the prices, then the people who are already getting the worst end of the deal in a market society will be the ones who can't take it anymore. And so, the rise in fuel prices might have been the straw that broke the camel's back for the people who came onto the streets in Paris and in the cities and towns around France last autumn, but there were a lot of other straws before it. And I think that the similarity of tactic between XR and the Gilets jaunes is really striking and has a clue to what's called for. Bringing things to a halt, actually stopping the endless movement of traffic and forcing people to slow down gives us a clue as to what it looks like to stop treating politics as something that can be rooted around by means of the market, and to realize that there is we have to actually slow down and meet each other again and begin having the conversations about what the hell we do, how the hell we do it, because we can't go on the way we've been doing. And actually everybody knows that at some level. It's there a quarter of an inch below the surface in so many of the different conversations and debates and so many of the apparently opposed forces within our societies right now, is this sense of how badly astray things are, and of the impossibility of things going on, as well as the impossibility of imagining how else they might go. So there's a clue there, and one of the things that's come through in this same cultural moment as XR and the school strikes and deep adaptation and so on, is this language of climate emergency. And it's a very powerful language and potentially a very dangerous language. To invoke the word emergency in politics is not a safe thing to do. The default meaning of emergency, a state of emergency, is the suspension of the rule of law, the suspension of democratic process. In Britain, it's possible to appeal in a kind of nostalgic, slightly Brexity way to the Second World War and dig for victory and so on as providing a model for how we might deal with the climate emergency. For obvious reasons, in many parts of Europe, that appeal is a darker and scarier proposition. And I don't say this to say that it's a mistake to talk about climate emergency, to declare climate emergency, to mobilize around this concept. I say it to say that there is a responsibility if that is the language we use. And I think that among the different movements and protagonists who have brought this language of climate emergency to the fore, XR has been the clearest about this, because the third demand of XR for citizens' assemblies is integral to what it means to have emergency democracy. I think it's quite clear that our democratic systems are not fit for purpose and not capable of responding to the mess that we're in. And therefore, to talk about climate emergency pushes towards one of two paths: less democracy or more democracy. And I think that some of the other places where the climate emergency language is coming from, whilst their instincts would very much lean towards more democracy rather than less, have not been clear about foregrounding that within the proposition of climate emergency. So again, that's something that I would commend Extinction Rebellion for having been so clear about. And there are clues and connections here. If you trace back the spirit of what spilled out onto the streets in France with the Gilets jaunes, if you go back to 2010, there was a manifesto called Indignez-vous, Get Angry, that was written by a man, I think already in his 90s, who was a concentration camp survivor, had been a fighter in the French resistance, had been an international lawyer who'd been involved in drafting human rights legislation after the Second World War, and who in his old age was articulating actually many of the sentiments that have been expressed by people around the Gilets jaunes. Indignez-vous also was a reference point and an inspiration for the Indignados movement that took off in Spain in the summer of 2011. And we all know about the year when it was kicking off everywhere, as Paul Mason put it. And we're very quick to remember Occupy. And Occupy is part of the story and the DNA of some of the people who have brought Extinction Rebellion to life. But another part of that DNA comes from Spain and begins with the Indignados movement, which brought 8 million people into occupations of city and town squares all over Spain. And that's a country, I think the population of Spain is 46 million. So it's an extraordinary proportion of the population took part in Occupy-style protests that summer in Spain. And after that, it went in two directions. One was the Podemos party that has emerged as a sort of Spanish equivalent in some ways of Syriza in Greece in the year or two afterwards, and is there in the national political space in Spain. But the other one, which has had less attention, is the municipalism movement that began with grassroots activists in cities in Spain doing things like resisting the seizure of properties by banks. The banks were evicting people who had lost their homes as a result of the financial crisis. People got organized locally to help families who were going to be kicked out of their homes. And out of this, they grew into creating these grassroots political platforms that stood against the existing parties in Spain, in many of the cities, and won power, and have been implementing attempts at the kinds of radical democracy that the Citizens' Assembly demand of Extinction Rebellion speaks to. And I know that some of the people who I have spoken to who were involved in the development of the ideas that fired the spread of Extinction Rebellion had direct experience of and inspiration from that. So there's a little arc there by which you can see how these different eruptions over the last 8 months have common elements, common roots. Citizens' Assembly is a demand that you see in many of the statements coming out of the Gilets jaunes movement in France as well. So less democracy or more democracy is the choice that's on the table once you have said that this is an emergency. And that's anyone who's involved in organising around declarations of emergency, bring that into the conversations that you're part of, because it needs to be there. I was writing about all this stuff for this book that is coming out this week, that Penguin are publishing, that has been edited by Extinction Rebellion activists. And as I was writing about it, there was a thing that kept coming up in my Facebook feed. It was a paid-for ad from some organisation I hadn't heard of who wanted to fix climate change by planting 8 billion trees. And I'm going to assume that they are as scared as many of us are by climate change, and I'm going to assume that their intentions are good, even if their model of what we need to and can do is slightly naive. But what struck me was the way in which they framed their pitch. Because when you clicked through to their website, it gave you this really quite detailed dystopian picture of the world we were going to be in by 2050, the world that our children were going to be in. And then it said, but if we plant 8 billion trees, then the dystopian future can go away and everything can continue as it is. And I thought, it reminded me a bit of all of the commentators who were caught off guard by Brexit and by Trump. Like, the appeal of the proposition of everything can continue as it is not as broad as the people who had written this text seemed to think. The morning that I read that, on the front page of The Guardian, there was a report of a survey showing that the number of young people in this country who say that life is not worth living has doubled in a decade. Now stands at nearly 1 in 5. Everything can continue as it is. And this brings me to the language of sustainability, this term that has been really at the center of what any of us who have worked professionally or been drawn into the grown-up conversations around a thing like climate change over the last 30 years have been part of talking about. Whatever sustainability starts out meaning, its tendency as a language is to end up meaning sustaining our current way of living, i.e. the current way of living of perhaps 1 in 7 people alive on the planet today. And that project has failed. As David Wallace Wells will point out, we have burnt more fossil fuels since the IPCC was founded 30 years ago than we had up to that point in the whole of human history. But also, in some way, it was a non-starter. Like the proposition that what we need is the greatest mobilization of human effort in history in order that as much as possible can stay just how it is right now. It's not, it's no way to call people to arms or to life. It doesn't call anyone to life, that proposition. And I think that part of the moment that we're in is, while these movements have been breaking out and occupying the bridges and Fridays for the Future and all of this, a parallel thing is going on further inside and quite high up within institutions, which is the story that you're meant to tell about climate change is straining from multiple directions and reaching a breaking point, a rupture. I began to realize this when I was passing through Brussels on my way to England last October, and someone I didn't know had got in touch and asked for a meeting, and we sat down at the Eurostar terminal at breakfast time, and over a coffee, I realized that what she was really asking me was, how do I, in my role inside an institution, say the unsayable without simply casting myself outside into the world of the people who aren't taken seriously? Because she had been involved in writing a report over those few weeks in which, in order to leave the assumption of economic growth unchallenged, it was necessary for them to state that by 2030, I can't remember whether it was 50 or 80% of Europe's entire electricity supply would be going into producing the synthetic fuel to keep the container ships coming from China. And she was certain that there were other people in other offices around that city writing reports that were also spending 50% or 80% of Europe's entire electricity supply by 2030, and that this was being spent many times over in order to allow the top figures within these organizations to go on talking confidently about green growth and about how it was going to be possible to tackle climate change without having to question our economic model. But what I've picked up over the months since is that quite rapidly that is reaching a breaking point. There's a story that I've heard from more than one direction about what happened when Greta Thunberg had a meeting with Emmanuel Macron, the French president, that Macron actually said to her, the reason why France has failed, despite my attempt at leadership, the reason why France has failed to meet even its existing targets for cutting emissions is economic growth. Now, if that conversation is beginning to happen in those rooms, then we are at a very, very interesting threshold. Because once you question that assumption, it's kind of an event horizon. There isn't a nice, easy route by which you go from capitalism with economic growth to capitalism without economic growth. And I don't say this as a proponent of some system that I think should replace capitalism. I don't even say it as a proponent of post-capitalism. But we know on the one hand that the only reason we need economic growth is a social construction, the fiction of money in the way that it works right now. And there have been other money systems that have worked for fairly complex societies in different times and places in human history, not all of which have been dependent on a model in which constant growth or a long-term trend of growth is required in order for the system not to collapse. It's a feature of this particular model of money, not of all models of money. But that social construct is like the tablecloth on top of which the glasses and plates and cutlery of our whole way of living are currently standing. And so in a sense, the question which is being asked by those of us who are taking to the streets as activists, but also actually by politicians and decision makers quietly and away from the cameras in some of the rooms where the decisions get made, is how do you pull that tablecloth out pretty quickly without just smashing everything? In one email thread that I was copied in on a couple of weeks, a senior European bureaucrat saying, look, this is not about GDP. What it's about is a whole social model, healthcare systems, education systems, welfare provision, which actually is only possible so long as you have the functioning economy as we have known it. So if we're serious about needing to choose between growth and life, which I think it's pretty clear we are, then that includes the question of how are we going to meet the needs which we have grown up assuming and actually believing ourselves to be the good guys if we're the ones on the side of politics that argues for the kinds of social democratic or welfare systems and institutions that we have inherited from the recent past. It's not what this guy said was, I haven't seen a proposal for what we do instead, and I'd really like to see one because I might be able to take that to the people that I need to convince in the next stage in this conversation. And I think that there are things that can't be seen from the rooms where the decisions are made, that contain clues as to what it looks like and how we make life work without lots of the nice things that we've taken for granted, as well as lots of the things that it's easy to slag off about a consumer society. But the more I've caught glimpses of those conversations going on inside the institutions, the more I've realized that I have to temper my natural anarchist instincts and have a certain degree of respect for the difficulty of the position that the people in those rooms are in. But I turn that back to this question of more democracy or less democracy. I don't want somebody to provide the decision makers with the plan for how we're going to do it, which you shortcut democracy in order to implement. What I want to see is the kind of thing that they have experimented with at the city level in Spain with the municipalist movement, of involving far more people in the processes of figuring out and experimenting with and doing other ways of being human together and making life work. Because there's a phrase that's been ringing in my head since the end of last year as I was beginning to get the picture of quite how much things were changing and how fast. And it's something I said to Anna, my partner, when we took a couple of weeks out at the end of the year and went offline and were just reflecting on the work that we're doing and what we might be able to help with within the process. And I said, this is about negotiating the surrender of a whole way of living. And the way of living that most of us were born into, the way of living which has been held out as the promise, the destined future for everybody else. And when I say negotiating a surrender, we spent a day talking about this yesterday, and it was really helpful for me to hear all of the questions and the voices that came through in that conversation. And one of the things that came through really strongly is we need to know the things that we are not prepared to surrender. And I think that's really important. But I was thinking about it further today, and I was thinking, part of the role of surrender is that it's about not fighting to the last ditch for it all. There's a real danger that powerful forces will take things all the way down the line to defend for at least a few people the inheritance of the way of life of the most prosperous people in societies like this today. And negotiating the surrender of our way of living, there's always, whenever you use we or our, there's always a question mark around that word. It invites the question, who is this we you speak of? But I say it partly because I need to acknowledge that it's not just Macron and his friends at Davos that I'm talking about, but that to a greater or lesser extent, almost all of us in this room have things to surrender if we're serious about that process, including the story that we represent, the pinnacle of and the destination of where humanity has been going since the time of the Natufians, or since that bone being thrown up in the air by the savannah ape. And I think there are clues that it's possible. One of them, let me just ask it to you as a question. Think for a moment about the economic activity that makes up the activity of the society around you in the place where you live, and how much of that could go overnight. And if nobody was made hungry or homeless as a result, which is a big if, no one would really miss it. How much of the activity that goes into that figure of GDP is basically meaningless? David Graeber gave us some evidence of this when he wrote his essay, Bullshit Jobs, and then developed that into a book, because the reaction he got to that essay was huge. He threw out the suggestion in the essay that much of the activity making up the economy of early 21st century developed societies was perceived to be pointless and meaningless by the people doing it. And he was overwhelmed by the strength of the response of people saying yes. And that, there's a hidden potential there, because you don't have to get rid of that, you don't have to phase that out by 2050. You just have to figure out a way in which people don't become hungry or homeless as a result of that chunk of the economy going. And really, the time scale within which it ought to be possible to do that is probably months rather than years, if we get to this point of emergency democracy. So that's, to me, like one glimpse of what it might mean. And I'm throwing this phrase out here about negotiating the surrender, but I don't want to, I'm not throwing it out there and holding on to it tightly and saying this is the answer, this is what everyone needs to be talking about. It's just a contribution to the conversations going on here and in lots of other places to see if it helps unlock thoughts and possibilities. And I'm not attached to whether that this particular language goes anywhere or not. That doesn't matter. But to wrap this bit up, and then we can do something slightly more conversational, I had a couple of last bits for you. The first is a kind of back of an envelope list that I made a while ago of the kinds of tasks that might be worth doing in a time of endings. And it goes like this. Salvage the good stuff that we can get to take with us. Notice and name the things that we are not willing to surrender. Take responsibility for something that has a chance of being around when you're gone, and where you have a chance of contributing to whether or not it's around. And it's only going to be a chance because it only ever was a chance. But that's the first type of work, is salvage work, taking responsibility. Which of the achievements of the recent past will we not willingly let go in the reality of the journey that we're going to go through, whether it fits Jem's map of rapid or near-term social collapse or whatever other pattern it goes down. But I think we can probably, most of us, agree that things are going to get harder and harsher, and actually have been for lots of people for a good while already in many parts of our societies. What are the things that we are going to take responsibility as individuals or together with others for? And we don't have to come up with one collective answer for that. But that's one type of action. Another one is mourning the good things that we don't get to take with us and telling their stories so that those stories do go with us. There are going to be achievements of the recent past that we will not get to hand on to our children the way we thought we would, and that are genuinely good things, but that we're not going to be able to afford in the kind of society that we're headed into. So, mourn those things well, tell their stories so that those stories come with us for a while yet at least. And again, you don't have to come to some kind of consensus as to which things belong on the first list and which things belong on the second list. 3, notice the things that were never as good as we told each other they were, that we are being given the chance to leave behind. A huge influence for me is the work of Ivan Illich, who wrote a set of books in the 70s, questioning some of the most sacred institutions of modern Western societies and saying, beyond a certain point, our healthcare systems make us sicker, our education systems make us stupider, our prisons create criminality. That last one is the easiest one to grasp, perhaps. But I think that Illich is a thinker who has a lot to give us in these kinds of conversations that are called for now. And one of the things I got from Illich was learning not to mistake an underlying social good for the particular institutional form which it has taken around here lately. We may be called upon to give up institutions which have been homes for things that matter deeply, but we may find other humbler homes for those things on the journey that lies ahead. And lastly, look for the dropped threads, the pieces from earlier in the story that might help, the ways of knowing, the ways of doing things. We've been taught this grand story, this map of progress, according to which there is a kind of, a Hans Rosling trajectory from the bottom left to the top right on the chart. And one of the ways that handicaps us is it teaches us to think of the past as a shit version of the present. It teaches us to think of the ways that people have lived in other times and places as simply a more impoverished version of the way that we are living now. It hides the difference and diversity of the past from our eyes. And it teaches us to see the past as a set of abandoned prototypes for our current way of living. The past is a stranger thing than that. It's more like a library full of the many different ways that people have made life work in different times and places. And I don't say this to be nostalgic or to say that there is any golden age that we ought to try and get back to. Part of it is almost the opposite. The level of detachment from consequences that has been normal in the societies most of us were born into has been impossible in almost all the other times and places people have lived. It's been the privilege of mad emperors to live with the sort of disregard for the consequences of your actions that is normal and almost required for participation within the societies that most of us were born into. So the lives of our ancestors have mostly been harsher than ours in ways that we do not like to think about, just like we don't like to think about the lives of the people who make our iPhones or the people who mine the coltan that go into them. But precisely because of that, they couldn't afford the layers of delusion that have prevailed around here lately, and therefore, for that reason, among others, they have a lot to teach us about how we make life work as this collision with ecological realities unfolds. So that's my back of an envelope list of the 4 things. Salvage good things that we have a chance of taking with us. Mourn good things that we have to leave behind and carry their stories with us. Notice things that were marked as good but may never have been as good as we told ourselves they were. And look for things from earlier in the story, things that have been treated as obsolete, that may actually contain stuff that could make all of the difference as we go on. I talked at the beginning about the Natufians and the Younger Dryas and the period of climate change that hit them. The Younger Dryas saw all kinds of things that had been returning to Northern Europe die out again. Oak trees. 30 or 40 years ago, people who study this stuff thought that the oak trees had survived in southern Greece and Turkey and then spread out again once the climate warmed at the beginning of the Holocene, from there in a kind of march out across the continent. But then the palynologists, the people who study ancient pollen and seeds, kept finding acorns in times and places where they shouldn't be within the record. There wasn't time for oak trees to have spread back that fast to countries like this. And so these days, the theory is based around something called cryptic northern refugia. These are pockets that lie too far, further north than a species ought to be. They're cryptic because they're so small they hardly show up in the record. And when, at the end of the last ice age, at the end of the Younger Dryas, temperatures in Northern Europe jumped by 7 degrees within a decade. That wasn't a global change, that was a regional change as a result of what was happening with the North Atlantic. Those tiny, seemingly insignificant pockets reseeded the landscapes with oak trees and strawberries and apples. And some people say that the myths about the Garden of Eden carry a deep cultural memory from the experience of communities in Europe and the Middle East who lived through that rapid change. There are cryptic northern refugia within our societies. There are pockets within which ways of doing things for reasons other than because you're paid to or told to are still practiced. And there are pockets within which the kinds of cultural practice, the kinds of cultural memory that will be called for as life gets harsher have survived or have been rediscovered and reinvented. And mostly those pockets look too small to be significant from the perspective of people sitting in Brussels asking, how the hell are we going to do things given that we can't go on with economic growth and we don't know how to go on without it? But to the extent that I have a little bit more hope than the people I met when Jem Bendell and I went to speak at the European Commission 3 weeks ago, it's because I've seen more of those pockets in places like these than they have had time to see in the lives and the careers that they have had. So the cryptic northern refugia and the role that they played at the end of the Younger Dryas, I leave that with you as a little acorn of hope. Life will almost certainly go on. You know, it's very unlikely that humanity will succeed in the project of sterilizing the planet and killing off all life. We like grand projects as a species, but we tend to fall short, and I think we'll fall short on that one too. We have brought about one of the great bottlenecks in the history of this living Earth, just at the point where we are beginning to reawaken after centuries in places like this of being deaf to the living Earth. How much comes through that bottleneck, to what extent it includes creatures like us, I think those things are still in play. And I think that we're all going to live through the beginnings of a process that is going to continue long after all of us are gone, but we can plant some acorns along the way.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was really interesting, and yeah, I never heard you speak. Ooh. So my question, I'll be quick, is to what extent do you think we need to be wary of the techno fixes, which are providing a lot of what I think is false hope, but reassurance to the general public, and excuses for non-action, such as, I'm not just talking about geoengineering, but all sorts of things to do with genetic engineering, synthetic biology, nanotechnology, these kind of, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I think we need to be very wary of them, and also we need to be wary of the supposedly neutral conversations about technology which we are invited into as well. I don't mean to say that we need to be, crudely anti-technological, but often when I hear somebody say, well, what we need is to be pragmatic and to recognize, not be ideological about technology, but to recognize that we need to treat each technology on its own terms. I'm a little bit suspicious of that. I think that if anybody's interested in kind of going down the rabbit hole of the conversations and thinking around it, I would really direct you towards the work of Alf Hornborg, who's a Swedish professor of human ecology at Lund, but he writes in English, and the way that he uncovers the hidden side of the stories we tell about technology, and in particular the way in which many of the technologies that we tell as simple stories of progress are actually stories of redistribution of time that are liberating for people who are on one end of the sort of world system of the center and the periphery at the expense of people on the other end of those systems. But also, I think that in a more general public debate, one of the roles that the faith in and the promise of the techno-fix plays is to keep us away from the encounter with the depth of the mess that we're in. If you think about, some people say, right, what's happened over the last 8 months is the latest in a series of periodic awakenings of attention, a sort of attention cycle around climate change. And the last of them was sort of 2005 to 2009, bookended by Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth and the COP meeting in Copenhagen, and Climate Camp is sort of part of that. But if you think about An Inconvenient Truth as an iconic moment within that phase, An Inconvenient Truth starts by offering you the vision of the world from space, the fragile Earth. This is what is at stake. And by the end, you're being told a list of things to do that basically start with changing your light bulbs. And I think that that's typical of the way in which communication around climate change has gone until this last year, which is that it's been dominated by very reasonable sort of attempts to think and talk about sustainability without scaring people too much, because if you scare them too much, they'll switch off. And it's, not only has it not brought people to the abyss, to the encounter with climate change as something that actually calls all of our assumptions and stories and way of living into question, it's actively walked people away from the abyss and to a story of how we get to keep as much of this as possible. And I think that what's happened over the last year that didn't happen in a big way in 2005 to 2009 is on a cultural level, rather than in some subcultural niche like Dark Mountain, people are having the dark night of the soul, the experience of having yourself, your sense of yourself, the future you thought was there, the role you thought that you, people like you, a species like ours was playing within the planet, having that called into question, which is an incredibly disorienting and difficult experience, but a necessary one. And if I'm a little more hopeful now than I was a year ago, it's because I'm seeing that happen. And so one of the reasons I'd be cautious of the techno-fix stuff is just because it's been a very effective way of deferring that encounter with what climate change is asking of us.
Thank you. Okay. Can you just say who you are?
Yeah, thanks. John Hislop, I'm a physician. Thank you, really very useful. You've run the gamut of the story very nicely. How encouraged are you by the news last week that Shell at its AGM was challenged seriously about having a work stream and reporting back on what it would do to meet carbon targets and to respond to climate change? Is this the beginning of the corporate revolution and a second industrial revolution. Is that the solution, or is that the diversion? Echo your recent argument, response, that actually it's diversionary and we should keep up the pressure from below.
Well, definitely keep up the pressure from below. I wouldn't want to be as flatly skeptical as some friends of mine are about the noises that we're hearing from corners of the corporate world. Inside institutions, inside corporations are human beings who are parents or aunts, uncles, whatever, who are as scared in many cases as you and I are. In the essay that I wrote for the new Dark Mountain book, where I talk about XR, amongst other things, I remember this experience in 1998, it must have been, at the G7 summit in Birmingham, when I was there at the Reclaim the Streets protest, and I ended up, due to my not being the person you want on the front line, I do not have good reflexes in these situations. There were 12 of us standing in front of a car holding a banner. The other 11 somehow managed to get out of the way. I was the one on the bonnet of the car as the panicked driver put his foot down and the police let him drive off onto this empty stretch of motorway. And I had this moment of clarity as I was looking through the windscreen into his eyes. I went, he has no more clue than I do what to do at this point. And there's this phrase, the Overton window, that describes the sort of space of what is sayable in the rooms where the decisions get taken and in the grown-up public debate. And one of the things that's been going on over the last 8 months is that the Overton window has been shifting really fast. This, what it is possible for people to say in different contexts is changing. But I have this sense of looking through the Overton window and this face looking out from the rooms where the decisions get made, and that same moment of shared, fuck, you don't know what to do either. So I think that there are real structural forces that limit how much faith one should put in the noises coming from inside the boardrooms or wherever. But one shouldn't discount the presence. Right, okay, it's this simple. All of us are more than the bits of ourselves that we get to take to work or to school, or even often to the family that we grew up in. And the same thing applies even to the people most deeply embedded within the most toxic parts of the system that is doing this to the world. Those people, in many cases, may be least in touch with the parts of themselves that they can't bring to that role, but it doesn't mean those parts aren't there or are completely unreachable. And strange conversations away from the front lines are going to be part of what's called for if this surrender is going to happen, I guess.
Thank you. Question over here. Yeah. Oh, Ashley. Yeah, no.
Sorry, there's a speaker. Come far away. Yeah, thank you. Really interesting and very good to hear you open up the question of who are we when we're having these conversations, which I think is, as you know, very vital. And I suppose the question in that context is about the concept of negotiating a surrender, which is something that is very welcome from those of us who've lived high on the hog, from the benefits of other people's hard labour. And that's over many centuries, since our culture here sort of enslaved large parts of the rest of the world and continues to do so. But in which context I don't think that negotiating the surrender is an appropriate language for many such people. Maybe for a lot of the humans, let alone other beings alive on this earth at this time, it's more a question of renegotiating the peace.
I like that. Thank you. Yeah, I think for me, if it is, and I hold it open as a question, if it is helpful to have a conversation about surrender, that's very context specific. For me, the surrender of privilege, the surrender of the story of development, which is an extension of the story of colonialism, is or might be a name for the work that needs to be done from this end of the world system at this moment. But anything that needs to be done from this end needs to be done in dialogue, and a dialogue where the most important thing is to listen with. Vanessa Andreotti talks about low intensity struggles and high intensity struggles, and that one of the difficulties in the international contexts where she and I meet is often you have people who are coming from contexts of high intensity struggle and people who are coming from contexts of low intensity struggle in the same room, without a recognition of quite how hard the work that calls for is, and how provoking actually the language and the experience and the conversations of those who are coming, like me, from a context of low intensity struggle can be. There's a really great piece in the new, I'm not trying to plug the book, but there's a great piece in the new Dark Mountain by a South African activist and climate researcher that I was really, really happy to see in there, because it talks about that work. I'm just scanning through here trying to find her name and her essay. Rebecca Freeth, Burning to be Understood. And she talks about deep democracy and the need to stay with the heat and stay in the fire of the decolonial work that is called for. And that, there's loads more I could say about that, but also there's loads that it's not my place to be the person who's saying it as well. But thank you for that. Sorry.
Another one over here.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Dougald. That was really makes me question lots of the things I believe. I heard you speak with Paul Kingsnorth at Schumacher quite a while ago, and it made me really question some of the things I believed then, and you've done the same tonight, so thank you. Some of the stories you told reminded me of some of the stories that Jared Diamond tells in Collapse, particularly the things you mentioned about so many people have a vested interest in keeping things as they are, right to the point of collapse and no return. And that makes me question about how citizen assemblies might work if you have citizens' assemblies when the water's only up to our knees rather than our arse. Have you got a comment on that?
Yeah. I was thinking this afternoon about some of the conversations I had with friends after the Brexit vote. And before I moved to Sweden, I lived in London for 5 years, which was long enough. But I grew up in the northeast of England, and I spent most of my 20s living and working in South Yorkshire. And I had this experience after the referendum of this real gulf opening between me and a lot of my friends who were on the same side in terms of how we had voted, because they didn't know anyone who hadn't voted Remain, or they thought they didn't know anyone who hadn't voted Remain. Some of them have gone into a sort of liberal fear of democracy, a fear of the people who voted Leave, and a fear of democracy because of the result of that referendum. And I wish I knew how to help them get past that. Because for a start, as my mum would say, ask a silly question, get a silly answer. Like the idea that the result of a binary question on the voting card that day that then gets to be interpreted by Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, the idea that that's giving people too much say, which is sort of what some of my friends seem to have ended up thinking because they were, like me, on the losing side of that vote. And that comes around to the question about citizens' assemblies because if a citizens' assembly is basically an opinion poll, then we're screwed. The promise of citizens' assemblies and the experience of the referendum in Ireland on the abortion law is one of the places that people find hope for this, is that it's a deeper democratic process in which, through having much greater trust and responsibility put on you as effectively a member of a jury, because that's what you are if you are selected for a citizens' assembly, you go into a process in which you are able to express things you could never express in response to a question on a opinion poll survey, and you actually learn things and think about things and are changed by the experience of participating in that process. So yeah, any kind of citizens' assembly type process has to have that quality to it, and the evidence from places where citizens' assemblies have been used is quite promising. But also, I mean, the Diamond book is quite problematic. There's a whole book dedicated to carefully critiquing all of the stuff that Jared Diamond gets wrong. I can't remember what it's called, but if you Google critique of Jared Diamond's collapse, you'll get there. And not least, it might be that disproportionately the most powerful people within society are inclined to cling on for as long as possible. But my sense is, and I think there are grounds for believing this, that actually that thing of, we know that the game is up, is an incredibly widespread, whether articulated or intuited thing within our societies. And one little piece of evidence I would give for that is that since the beginning of this decade, across the Western countries, by majorities of 2, 3, or 4 to 1, people have answered that young people today will struggle to have the quality of life that their parents have had, rather than their lives will be better than their parents' generation. There's an incredibly widespread awareness that things are, to greater or lesser extent, fucked. I mean, the David Graeber bullshit jobs thing is another instance of, asking questions that disclose the stuff which actually rarely breaks out into ordinary political debate. And what's happened with the Labour Party since Corbyn's election at its best has been an exception to that, in terms of some of that latent energy of sense of how far things are astray. But my hope is that a citizens' assembly type process can help people work through and think through and cross some of the polarizations that the corporate internet has fostered in what passes for public debate right now. And so you might be pleasantly surprised by where it can get us to. But it's a risk.
Over here.
Hi. You've used an expression quite a few times this evening, the decision makers. So my question to you is, who do you think are the decision makers? Because corporations are legally bound to make as much money for their shareholders as possible. That's the system at the moment. There are over 250,000 people in the world who have a net value of more than $30 million. It's estimated that all combined, that's $37 trillion, which is sloshing around the world looking for a home and looking for money and profit. Governments are petrified with the markets and of upsetting economic growth. So who do you think the decision makers are?
Thanks for picking me up on that phrase. It's a shorthand and I think you've pointed to some of the reasons why it's more complicated than that. I was very struck by reading Yanis Varoufakis's book, Adults in the Room, about his experience of his 6 months as the Greek finance minister, negotiating with the people who would absolutely be high on a list of decision makers at a European and global level. Christine, I can't remember her surname, the head of the IMF, thank you. And Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister. And what struck me reading his book, and he sort of says it in the book, is it would be so easy to paint these people as the villains, but actually they are more like tragic. They're more like figures from a Greek tragedy. They're caught inside the tragedy of the failure of the institutions which they have invested much of their life in. What I got from that book was a picture of the helplessness, despair, and what's the third one? The ignorance, despair, and helplessness of power. So the ignorance is this moment with Christine Lagarde where she's telling him about what Greece ought to do, and he's realizing that she genuinely doesn't understand the reality of the issue that she's talking to him about. She's got it from an article in the Washington Post, and she doesn't know what the real issue behind this is. And any of us who've worked with people high up in the sort of formal positions of being quote unquote decision makers have probably had experiences of that just by virtue of being a human being on top of a large pyramid, not capable of containing within an ordinary human head the actual reality and knowledge. There's a massively filtered and narrowed version of the world that you are operating and making those decisions that you have the power to make from. The helplessness is this moment with Wolfgang Schäuble where Varoufakis turns to him and says, look, Wolfgang, I've followed your career for 25 years. You're a statesman. I've been in this job for 3 months. Can I ask you, as an elder statesman to a younger one, would you accept the terms that you are asking my country to accept? And Schäuble turns around and looks out of the window and then turns back and says, no, I couldn't ask my country to do that. And Varoufakis sees this sadness in this man who, in theory, is one of the most powerful men in Europe, and at that moment is just trapped with can't see any way that it's not going to end badly for this project that he's dedicated his life to. And then the last moment happens when Varoufakis is tendering his resignation to Tsipras, the Greek prime minister, and Tsipras says to him, look, Yanis, they're not going to give us the solution. And Varoufakis says, you don't get it. It's not about them giving us a solution. They need a solution. We have to be cunning and courageous enough to give them a solution. So there are moments where, far from the ordinary kind of picture of the decision makers being those powerful people in the room, actually those in the seemingly weaker position may be the ones who, with courage and cunning, can bring about change that looks impossible from those positions of formal power. I sometimes think of power as being a bit like velocity. It's like if you're driving at 250 kilometers an hour down the Autobahn, slightest twitch on the wheel, you're going to roll the car. And the more power you have, the faster you're driving. If you're driving a Land Rover across a field at 10 miles an hour, you can swing the wheel around all over the place. There is a room for maneuver, a kind of play that those of us who don't hold formal power have, that is part of the strange patterns by which change sometimes happens. I could go further down that, and I'd like to hear more about what you were bringing in, but those are some thoughts on that. Matt?
If no one else has got a question, I'm going to nick the last one.
There's been one hand that...
Where?
Yeah.
Okay.
I could say it's a second bite of the cherry, but very quickly, responding to your argument about Brexit, actually it's a fantastic opportunity because the nation is divided and it just needs some core leadership only to divert us off the course of Brexit, whatever the outcome, to common purpose, which is a transformation of society, a second industrial revolution to save the planet. Because with common purpose, whoever promotes that will get support. The Conservatives are going to be dead in the water, whatever happens. Never mind the middle ground, they can't make their minds up. But at least the Labour Party in this country, in the office of the shadow Chancellor, has suggested a 3-day week as becomes the norm, by example. And these are the opportunities. If they united behind a transformational standing at the next election, that would bring the country together and would park all other issues. And I think it's a great opportunity here and now to push that agenda, because the politicians might just be listening, even though the message that they don't seem to get, that the debate in the House of Commons was somewhat tokenism, I would suggest.
I think all I want to say is I hope you're right. Matt, do you want to squeeze in that last question?
It's not really a question, it was just something that the last thing you said about helplessness, ignorance and despair, I was trying to remember where she said it, but Arundhati Roy said something that just keeps coming into my mind since Extinction Rebellion broke cover. And she said that the people in the corridors of power are the least capable of serious transformative change, that even a Nelson Mandela, if he tries to step just to the left or just to the right of that Overton window of accepted business as usual, faces capital flight, mass impoverishment, and instant de-election. And she said the only way in which those kinds of voices are going to get raised in the corridors of power is for a large-scale social movement that makes it impossible for them not to. And I just wondered.
Yeah, the good people I meet on the inside are really, really keen for XR and the school strikes and everything, all the other manifestations of a social movement at the moment to continue and get bigger, because they feel that that strengthens their hand within the things that they're trying to do and can't do from the positions they're in. Doesn't mean that we can always find ways of bridging the language or actually finding ways of working together, but you know, that's definitely like that. They would probably agree with what Arundhati Roy.
Thanks. So, should we do one more? This better be the last one. So one more question, and we've got a couple of announcements before we close.
Thanks. This is a slightly different topic, but it's going to hit us on the back of the head before very long. I wonder if which it hasn't been mentioned tonight, along with climate change and resource depletion and the extinction of various species, we've got increasing energy cost of energy. Now, I don't know if anybody's talked with you about that, but it's something we all need to be aware of. And the guy I learned about it first from was head of research department of Tullett Prebon, which is a massive finance house. He wrote a report on it called Perfect Storm, which showed that our society, as a complex society, is going to go downhill very quickly, and it's already happening. And for his pains, because they couldn't make him redundant, they closed his department. They shot the messenger, basically. So I just wondered if in your conversations with all these central powerful people, whether that's one of the items that they're thinking about, because it's going to knock our system off kilter completely, because without surplus energy, we have no complex society. In fact, we have no society, really. We're back to medieval times really quickly.
Yeah, yes, definitely that is in the mix. I wouldn't want to overstate the conversations with powerful people that I have, but the bits that I brush up against conversations which include people who are, you know, quite deep and occasionally fairly high within institutions, that's definitely within the mix of things that these people are talking about.
Okay.
I think that's
Well,
it, isn't it, Matt?
before we thank Dougald, just a couple of announcements. First, about this evening, the bar's still open. When we're going to close now, but the bar's going to stay open for a bit. You're welcome to stay for a more kind of informal discussion. 3 announcements working backwards calendrically. On June the 20th at Cornwall College, Dr. Rupert Reed from the University of East Anglia is going to be the next guest of Manda Brookman and Café Disruptif. Rupert's a well-known XR spokesman that you'll probably recognise from media interviews around April. More tickets have been added. So there's a few more. It was sold out. A few more tickets have been added. Get in there quick if you want one. It's an unusual talk that evening because it invites, excuse me, my voice is going today, a pre-watch of a talk by Rupert Reed so that we can get straight to the Q&A rather than having this traditional short Q&A. So the whole evening is going to be a discussion based on the fact that everyone there has already listened to the talk. Now, the talk's linked in the Eventbrite page. We're also screening it here in Falmouth, and you'll see one of the bits of paper, the local XR group, screening a group here. We're asking you to contact us so we make sure we get the venue size right. So we're not just opening it tonight. We'll wait and see how many people come forward. And those of you that want to find more about what's going on about XR locally, Beth and Matt and Zoe, we've got 2 Exeter PhD, are you alumni PhD or are you just Exeter PhDs? And an MFA graduate from Falmouth, which seems appropriate, are running an XR induction at the Satellite Cafe, which you can find on a map easily on the edge of Falmouth. It's a brilliant little cafe that's worth finding out about on Tregennigy Industrial Estate. So Thursday evening, 7 to 9, get along and they'll tell you all about it. Or you can ask them now. But meanwhile, big thanks to Dougald and fantastic talk.